session, as most of the folks have joined us already. The people who have just joined us, the title for today's session is going to be Case Study on Writing Effective PRDs and Documentation. And the mentor for today is going to be Chris Butler. Chris is currently working as a lead product manager at Google right now and has previously worked with Facebook as well. So let's start with the session. I hope, Chris, you're joining us live today. Let me quickly know if you're here. Yeah. Hi, Chris. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much.
I'll just quickly stop sharing my screen and then we can start ahead. And Chris, if you can quickly introduce yourself, that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So great. Yeah, I'm Chris Butler. I'm a lead PM in the Google Core Machine Learning Group. And as she mentioned, I've worked at a lot of different places, very large places like Microsoft, Facebook, Cognizant, and Google. I've also worked at kind of medium-sized companies like Waze and Kayak. And I've worked at very small companies like design consultancies, my own startup, which was called Complete Seating, that was in the restaurant space, and kind of director of product for a venture capital firm that did a lot around innovation. So I've seen product management across a lot of different contexts, both small and large, and then also kind of very new companies to very old companies. And the question that I get an awful lot from product managers that I end up helping mentor or work with within the teams, like even the team that I work with right now, part of my role is to actually help figure out not only what are the templates that we should be using that are standardized across the entire team, but also the concepts about like helping people actually do critiques and do a better job in general. And good to see you, Ralph. Being able to up-level all of the kind of PRDs, but also PRFAQs and a bunch of other documents that we end up creating, like briefs. And so I'll be talking about a bunch of different types of things. I will take a kind of quick stop to just talk about PRDs specifically, but I felt like it was a good idea to talk a bit overall about the way that documentation is used within organizations and kind of where I've seen success and failure, and we'll go into kind of one case study at the very end. So first of all, like why docs? The next thing that we'll want to talk about are what are the different document types? What are some standard cycles for those document types? Some key questions you should be asking yourself about doc management. And I think this is something that's maybe more early stage for a lot of organizations rather than just like say an intranet site somewhere. What does it mean to go beyond the basics of writing documents? And then finally, just a quick case study where kind of, I think, made me realize an awful lot of things back at the beginning of my career about documentation in general. So why docs in the first place, right? I think the first thing that we usually think about is that docs are really made or written to be able to provide durability of information. And what I mean by that is that you'll create a document, it will be placed somewhere, it'll be linked to, or be shared in some way, but that people can go back and reference that all the time. And that's definitely one value of documentation. But I think another one that we don't always think about is that docs are actually there also for collaboration, right? So we use documents to help us have better discussions in some ways. And I think the difference between these two different spectrums, and I'm going to be talking about spectrums from a cultural standpoint later, I think there's this idea of contextuality for the document. And so is this document here to really allow for collaboration, right? It's something that is maybe not as durable, but is really valuable in the moment to be able to level set, provide options, have a better discussion, versus this idea of what are these documents that are meant to be existing for a very long time, may or may not be updated very frequently, but are at least available for a very long time so that people can link to them and start to build kind of on that context with their other documentation, right? Because documents don't exist by themselves. They actually exist as an entire body of documentation. It's almost like there are people that end up doing, say, TV shows or world building for, like fiction novels or even movies. They end up creating these like huge binders of information that essentially talk about everything in that world. And so what you should be thinking about as your documents is that it is this huge lattice work of documents that start to make up the way that you, not only does your team think about the world, but the way that the team wants to actually move forward into the future and build things for their customers. And so I think that's, we need to start thinking more holistically about these documents rather than just like as a singular document. So from that perspective, I think there's a bunch of different types of documents, and I wanted to at least like level set for what are some of the things that I think are most important, and then how does that actually fit with development cycles in general. So the first thing for durability, like these documents that should exist for a very long time and kind of set the stage for almost every other document. They tend to be things like a charter document, which is why does this team exist? This is actually something that I've seen missing from a lot of teams, is that they'll just kind of assume that they should exist rather than the idea of identifying who's maybe the customer or the particular type of business that this team is actually working on. But that charter document is incredibly important to level set, because if you have to keep on relitigating why does this team exist, that's actually a waste of time. And so that's why charter documents, I think, are really powerful as a starting point. You then have things like strategy, right? And I will include stuff like vision, mission, principles, purpose, values, any of these things that end up helping people make decisions better at their particular context. I kind of think about being inside of the strategy document. And things like headwinds and tailwinds, the idea of maybe even competitive landscape, those are all things that exist within the strategy. And I think they're different from this idea of charter, because charter is that why does this team exist? Strategy is how does this team make decisions, is really the way to think about that. And then roadmap, I mean, what are we going to be working on right now versus what are we going to work on in the near future or next? That is incredibly important for a team. And so these end up creating very important kind of like sets of documents that go from very high level abstractions to much lower level abstractions. And I've done some talks around what I'll call the product spine, but I think this product spine is about how do we like center what we do across these levels of abstractions that they're connected in some way. So the charter should be referenced from the strategy, and the roadmap should reference the strategy. And we should be linking all of these that in some way they're actually aligned in today's decision-making capability. And so I think that's incredibly important. When you get out of balance in that product spine, so to speak, you end up causing a lot of problems, I think, for the teams. And then the last thing I'd like to include here, but these tend to be much smaller documents or they're kind of ephemeral documents, but they're actually there for durability, is this idea of a decision document. So anytime that you end up making a decision that's really important, it's very good to actually document it for other people so that they can then reference that in the future as well. I think there's a paradox here, though, which is that you want to document as much as necessary, but you don't want to document everything. And what you don't know, unfortunately, is which decisions are going to be key to the future of your product. And so I think there's some balance here about like decision logs and decision document briefs that are really, really important and powerful. And so I always like to just mention this inside of the durability side, even though they can be more ephemeral documents. The next thing will be, I like to think about that there's documents, especially product managers, as they create documents. They do this across a couple different kind of timeframes for a standard software development cycle. So this is one that I just pulled off the web. Every team will have one that is maybe slightly different. They may actually focus on different areas. And we'll talk about like the cultural impacts of these things. But I think for each of these stages, like conceptualization and planning, design, implementation, kind of testing and release, and then maintenance, they each have kind of different requirements about what documents are really valuable in that case. So I would say, like, when we start conceptualizing as a product team, like, should we work on something, right? That's when we start to think about, traditionally it's been the one pager, right? Which I think there's a little bit of an anti-pattern here that the one pager ends up being just like a very short PRD. And so I think that's not as valuable, right? We've started to experiment and use PR FAQs within the team. And I think these are really interesting because the PR, if you write it as a kind of future speculative fiction about like where do you want the team to be, or what type of benefit are we providing to end customers, I think can be really powerful in at least identifying and socializing what is the value not only to the customer but to our business, and then how do we actually get started when it comes to understanding success, things like that. And I think we should even go further. I just wrote an article about how PR FAQs are really kind of, they are fiction in some ways. Almost all these documents are fictions because they're about something in the future that it doesn't exist yet. PR FAQs can be really powerful because it can align the team in some way, not only about like what is the ideal state, but what are the trade-offs that we're going to have to make to be able to realize that value. So I think that's really powerful. When we're actually doing the design of what are we going to build, there's a bunch of different documents that end up existing here. One of them is the PRD, right? But there's also engineering design documents. There's design mockups. There's red lines. There's all these different things that are kind of like within our cross-functional team, they end up creating additional documentation that goes alongside the PRD. And so I think when we think about it this way, I think the PRD is less of a complete listing of every possible thing that we could imagine about this, and more kind of focused in on the intersection between the customer, the technology, and the business case in some ways. But not like reduplicating all of these other different team cross-functional documentation that ends up existing. So I think that's an important thing to talk about. I'll talk about that in more depth in just a moment. When we get into implementation, this is where we start to actually look at specific requirements and even things like user stories, job to be done stories, whatever you end up doing to break up your work into a list of tasks by which engineering or design or whatever cross-functional team can start to actually implement these things. And so I think of these as less as documents and more as like lists of things that usually are in places like Jira or Pivotal or any of these different places that you end up tracking work in some ways. And we have a bunch of internal tools at Google that does this, but and large companies will end up having their own custom tools as well. So I think there is a good distinction to make between what should be in a PRD, which is a more durable document ideally, versus this idea of tasks and requirements that as you start to implement, things may change and you'll want to like change the sequencing of things. You may want to revise them, splitting stories, combining stories, canceling stories, all that type of activity, I think makes more sense inside of some type of tracking tool, even if it's something like an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Sheet. So I think that's interesting. When we start to get ready to actually push the release out into the world, there's a bunch of go-to-market things. So how do we partner with product marketing managers, marketing, comms, PR, and customer support so that we can get ready to put things into the world? And this could include customer content documentation, anything like that. So customer service manuals, right? We need to do a bunch of things around that. And then finally, when we talk about maintenance, there's going to be problems that will come up that we'll have to resolve in some way on a feature. And that may be a smaller type of work, like a brief is what I'll refer to those things as. But it could also be that we want to now like cancel this feature or remove it in some way. And so there's end of life documentation. How do we do migration away from something? This cycle keeps kind of repeating whenever you want to think about some type of new functionality, a new product, anything like that. You start to then repeat this cycle over and over again. And so you can tell that there's like lots of documentation that is generated every single time. Now, there are companies that do less documentation, and I'll talk about those kind of cultural differences, but I wanted to at least identify these are the key documents, so the key kind of stages that I think of within a team. So after that, what we will see is that there's a bunch of different type of documents that end up being much more kind of for collaboration. They're more ephemeral. The moment that you end up making a decision or having a meeting around a document, they end up starting to almost decay in some way where they're no longer valuable because of the fact that they're going to be updated or being worked on, but that they existed and now should be archived in some way. And so an example of that would be like what I call a brief, which is, here's a problem that we see. Here's how we think we should solve it, and here's the reason why. And so that type of documentation can be very small. This can be related very much to like a decision in itself. And I think there's some relationship, and I'll talk about decision-making a little bit later too, because I think that's a key component of this. I think proposals where we want to change something, a brief could be, here's more about what's happening. A proposal could be a little bit more forward about, here's what we actually think we should be doing. And then I would say the last kind of collaborative document, which I think is seen as a less collaborative, is really in general status. So if you're providing status through an email or a document where everybody adds their status, or something like slides where you're doing like a monthly business review or something like that, this idea of status, it should not be a one-way conversation, right? These are all documents where you want to create the document, you want to put information there, and then you want other people to come in and talk about it, comment on it, and actually discuss. If it's a one-to-end type of conversation where you're just broadcasting things, that becomes, in my opinion, much less valuable. The things that are really important about status, for example, are that you're getting feedback on what is going on right now, not only from your management team, but from your peers and other teams that end up having dependencies on you, or you have dependencies on them. And so I think status is like one of those things that is seen as just like a standard communication, but in reality should be more of a collaborative type of document. So maybe just in the chat, I would love to hear, what are some documents that people think about a lot that I didn't mention so far? So a document that someone really loves to have on their team that I didn't talk about yet. Business requirements document. Yeah. So I see business requirements documents as being more like a PRD, somewhere in between that kind of initial PRFAQ, like why are we doing this? What's the value? And sometimes bleeds over into the PRD, but that I think like it's a different terminology. It's maybe more from like a business analyst standpoint or a product analyst standpoint, but I think those are kind of fitting in those areas. It depends on the team culture as before. Yeah, escalation, that's a good point. I kind of see escalation as usually the brief. They've been called memos. You know, there's a bunch of things like that, which I think I kind of fit into that type of document where you're trying to give a very low context group of people, usually executives, an understanding of what's going on so that they can then like actually take some action. Marketing requirement documents. Yeah, so I see this, I think, where there's an interesting discussion about how we break up documentation between different teams. And so to me, marketing requirements, I kind of think of that as maybe like a go-to-market document and probably just a different name for the same thing that you're talking about. But on the marketing side, they then also have briefs that they need to write for agencies to be able to do creative, a bunch of things like that. Product roadmap. Yeah, I did mention the product roadmap. So I do think that is super important. Release notes. Yeah, I think this is another really important aspect of like whenever we're doing some type of launch, there's a bunch of different types of documentation for customer support, things like that I think fit in that. And this is where maybe where is the line about like release notes to me end up being more of a task that is part of launch rather than a specific document, because you may decide in some cases to not have release notes for a particular launch or a particular feature update. But yeah, I think that's a good part of like that go-to-market kind of area and things. Yeah, Alex asks, you know, what is the difference between PRD and requirements? Product requirements document does include requirements in it, of course. But I think for me, PRDs end up being a product manager-led document that is meant to be highly collaborative. And I think that is slightly different than what I've started to see, even inside of the teams that I work with today, where it's the requirements for what do we need to build right now, hyper specifically to like, maybe this is a time frame thing, right? So when I think about the PRD, if we're saying that usually a feature will take somewhere in the range of 1 to 3 months to launch or to work on, and then kind of get through the pipeline, maybe it's up to 6 months, including all the before and after stuff from just the implementation. I kind of see requirements or stories as being in the 1 to 3 day type of category, and could be organized into larger things, which, you know, sometimes people call epics, or like larger kind of segments of work that could be 1 to 3 weeks, right? And this comes from John Cutler, right? Like John Cutler talks a lot about these like 1 to 3 time ranges. So to me, and I feel like this is where like the kind of terminology is bankrupt in some way, and we just have to kind of like move forward and decide what you want to call it on your team. But I see it as that PRDs tend to be like an overall thing. Here's what we're going to be working on for a couple months at least. Requirements and stories tend to be something like, here's a task that an actual engineer or developer could take on like for 1 to 3 days. So I think that's like a really important thing that you should define as an organization. But I see that kind of like leveling of different timeframes as being part of the way that these documents end up working. So hopefully that's helpful. Cool. Well, thank you everybody for participating there. What would the functional requirements document, I guess, is what that would be. So let's talk a little bit. I'll get, yeah, okay, features requirement document. Yeah, I think like there's lots of different terminology here, and I haven't found any one that is perfect, unfortunately. But so we'll talk about solution design. And by solution design, I guess, do you mean architecture, like technical architecture, or do you mean solution design, like a designer user experience? Because I think those are also two things that I'll just talk about in a second. So we talk about PRD specifics, right? Like what should go into a PRD. I actually have a very simplistic rule or belief on what should go into a PRD. So the standard sections, as I see it, right, are a summary. This is something that most executives will read. This is the thing that is really valuable for people that are just getting into this document to understand kind of why are we doing this? And this should link to all of the other documentation that came before it, like a PRFAQ, charter documents, any strategy, things like that. I think you end up starting to link off to these documents rather than replicating it there. I think goals and non-goals specifically are really, really important and powerful. Like, what are the things that we think this feature will do? And I think that you can talk about this in a lot of different ways, right? We could talk about how it actually adheres to our principles. We could talk about OKRs and other types of like success metrics or target metrics or input and output metrics or whatever we want to talk about when it comes to like the outcomes that we want, both from for our customers and for our business. And then specifically, I put in non-goals because I think one of the things that can happen inside of PRDs is that you end up it grows larger and larger as people say, well, what about this or what about this? And so to me, having a specific section, which is like, here's the goals that we have, right? And then here's the list of things that we will specifically not do. And that could be just deferment. It could be that like, we're not going to do that for this version, right? It could be, we're not going to do it at this time. But it could also just be that this is not part of the way that we would ever do things. And I think this is very much related to assumptions as well, because I think whenever I've seen lots of principles being put into a document, they're actually just assumptions about the way the world works. And so we should just be clearer about like, what do we mean by these things that are kind of framing of what needs to happen, right? So I think that's a very important and interesting aspect to include is this, like, what are we not doing? And what are the assumptions that we have? And as long as those are true, it doesn't change anything about what we're saying in the rest of this document. So I think that's a very important section and can include a lot of different stuff in there as well. So, but I simplify it down to just kind of like goals and non-goals. I think this idea of journeys is really, really valuable, which ends up getting into essentially what do we believe needs to happen? And this is in a little bit of like what I'll call a hand wavy form, which is so based on all these goals, what is the hypothesis we have about the change we need to make to the product and how that impacts the end customer? And how is it that these different journeys actually exist in here? And this could be just the standard journeys, right? Like inside of Google, we call them critical user journeys. At other places, they could be like kind of a combination of job to be done and journey. People could create things like service blueprints, or there's lots of different types of journeys in the way that you want to illustrate things. And so you'll usually at least capture the major ones, right? Like this is what onboarding looks like. This is what a new user looks like when they get started. Here's what the most common path we want them to do. And then I think one of the things I learned from Facebook that was really powerful was that it's not just about this idea of like edge cases, but more about stress cases. And so they use that terminology specifically because while edge cases are interesting, right? Like here's like a type of output that would happen if someone does something kind of not that we would expect. But I think stress cases actually focus on where are there the biggest harms whenever something goes wrong for a certain set of people. And so I think those stress cases are actually very important inside the journey. I would not say that you need to like document every possible edge case, at least in the way that you would document like a full journey for something. But I think this idea of like, what are the harms specifically we're trying to avoid in some way that the journeys really need to make sure do not produce those harms. And so when I say harms, I mean that like if someone makes a mistake with something, that it ruins their account in some way. And so what are all the things that you're making sure that would try to avoid that type of thing? Or what are the recovery capabilities that end up being part of this journey? So I think that's another important aspect when we talk about journeys. It's not just like these major journeys that usually you would be documenting, but it's also these like stress cases that I think are really powerful or important. And then I think history is a very interesting thing. Now the good thing is that say Google Docs, right, does keep revision history of a document over time, but there's also a real value to, logging what are the major changes that have happened with this document over time. And not enough people, I think, take advantage of actually like versioned history inside of Google Docs. But I think that's like something that generally is very helpful for people to understand, like, how is this modified over time? Now, this is not, this is basically everything that I think should go. This is the main set of things that should go into a PRD. There's a bunch of other things that you could put in here. So for example, depending on the culture, you may want to have sign off of documents. And so that then requires that you have something like, it looks good to me type of table. And there's tools that will help you do that type of thing. There could be a bunch of requirements about like, how does privacy or safety or security or all those types of things that are kind of usually considered non-functional requirements fit into this document? Or how do you give them a kind of toehold inside the PRD to be able to link off to more in-depth understanding of those different topics? So that could create a different section. I think that the idea of including, I've been warming on the idea of actually thinking about deprecation as an important section of a document as time's gone on, because I think it actually it helps you reconfirm the assumptions you have about this feature and then why this feature should exist. So saying like, when should this feature no longer be around, I think is a really powerful exercise to be able to like reinforce the assumptions that you have there. So this is like, I think a dead simple version of a PRD ends up being this. Now people can add an awful lot of things, and that's, I think, going to lead us to what I'll call anti-patterns and kind of over documentation where other teams may be able to should be doing this type of documentation. So one anti-pattern that I've seen a lot is this idea of like relitigating things like principles, OKRs, other team-wide aspects. And what I mean by this is that like I've seen in certain places where there's like everybody writes a PRD for their feature, but they create different principles by which each of those features should exist. When the reality is like a principle should be something at a team level that we all agree to as a team, we want to operate this way. And so every one of those PRDs should then just reference that list of things and say, we are going to adhere by these principles. And we may actually amp up our adherence to these particular principles because that's super valuable in this particular feature. But I think like the moment that you start saying, I'm going to now rewrite some principles for this one feature, right? I think that you're making a mistake. Like it is not that type of thing. And same thing with OKRs. Like I think it depends on the culture you have for things like goals, but I've seen where people write specific OKRs for every feature when the reality is it should be a team level OKR that is informing the way that feature should be built, and that feature should connect in some way, right? You should make sure that the feature, if it's going to be built, tries to boost some of the key results that you're trying to go after. But I think doing this specifically in everything, I think is a really bad idea. The next thing I would say is that if you draft a very complete document, like a PRD, without including your cross-functional team, that is a bad thing. And usually it's a bad thing because not only do like engineers want to be involved in that type of discussion, but I think like, even though you may look like you tried to put a lot of care and thought into something, what will happen is that people don't feel like they're being brought along in the experience, and you're not going to actually harness all of the kind of cross-functional intelligence and knowledge that you have on your team. And so I think you need to find the right balance, and it's usually earlier than you'd think. And I'll talk about what I mean by that later. But I think like the earlier you can involve a cross-functional team into a document, the better. There is a balance, though, against perception, because what you don't want is you don't want people to like perceive you as a sloppy PM or someone that is not thinking about things. But this is also why like probably when you're getting ready to start writing a PRD, you should have things like team kickoffs where you collect people's thoughts, you get issues, you do things like pre-mortems, all that great stuff that you would do as like a collaborative team. Doing that kind of before you start writing the PRD or just after you have kind of the very beginning of a PRD, I think is great. And then you should be involving people as soon as possible in a way that makes sense for your team culture. But I think the earlier, the better in this particular case. And then I think, you know, if a document just kind of sits there and ends up kind of not being referenced anymore, I think not updating with the current status on these documents is really, I think it causes a lot of confusion. And so all I mean by this is that if something has been released and there's a new feature or functionality document that talks about it, you should link to that at the very top of your document. If the document is for a feature that never shipped, you should mark that at the top of the document. All of these like Google Drives and Microsoft SharePoints are just like littered with so many documents that should have been end of life, but people don't realize it. And so I think it's your responsibility as a PM to make sure that at least major status changes to these things is actually marked on these documents. Otherwise, people misunderstand them all the time. And then I would also try to avoid certain sections inside of your document, or at least break it out into another document and have a different team function own them. And so one of those would be specific requirements, right? Like I think here's a 1 to 3 day task that a engineer should take on. That should go into your task management system because those things are going to churn, they're going to change, and you want it to be where engineering is actually doing that updating rather than in your PRD, which will then become stale almost immediately. I think this idea of like user research, right? It's good to include summaries or clips from user research, but you should be referencing UXR documents, summaries, whatever's out there, you should be referencing that as much as possible. If you don't have this is where I think like product managers end up taking on the role of researchers sometimes. And so you should try to actually separate out the research and the PRD. And the reason why is that the PRD itself is about your kind of abductive thinking, which if like inductive and deductive is logical from like rules to a specific case and vice versa, abductive thinking is this concept that is we're going to take the evidence we have, make a imaginative leap to what we think should happen because we have imperfect information. There's a lot of uncertainty in a bunch of things like, will our solution have value? Is there actually a linkage between what we can do and the outcome? Things like that. You should make that very separate, right? The abductive thinking of the PRD, which is a hypothesis, from what have we observed, right? Inside user research, that should be a separate thing. And these should be like, basically, there should be a firewall between those two things. And part of the reason why is that you should never, just take like what a customer says and then turn that into a work item. You should be trying to generalize or find the right kind of like portion of generalization or balance of generalization from this type of user research. So I think it's really important to separate those things out, because also that user research should be more durable than maybe even your PRD, right? Like if it's generative research about here are the problems that people have, that probably doesn't change as much as this PRD would. So I think separating those things out are really valuable and important. UX redlining. So I think sometimes we can get it like design and UX will like want to build out very specific requirements about how the design works. One, I think that's a little bit of an anti-pattern. I'd rather design and engineer like mob on a particular topic together rather than like creating documents that are kind of thrown over the wall. But I think this type of redlining it should just be done in a specific tool. You can reference it like if there's someone working in Figma or Sketch or whatever, right? You should be referencing those documents. And you can provide summaries, but getting too in depth in the PRD, I think, again, starts to get way too into the weeds about things that will change over and over again as you start to implement and test things out. And the technical designs, right? Like your engineering team should own the technical design documents. They should write them ideally after you've completed the PRD, not before. And even then, like, I think there's some interesting issues around just like, how does this work when it comes to technical design? So these should all be separate sections, like documents altogether, because of the fact that this is not like specific for this point in time for this type of use. And so that would be my argument. So now let's talk about standard cycles overall for documents, right? Outside of kind of this standard development lifecycle. So this is very much related to decision-making, right? I'm part of a project right now called the Uncertainty Project, which is at the uncertaintyproject.org. And it's really all about the concept of how do we do a better job of kind of discourse and decision-making within the world of kind of like software and product and things like that. And I've broken it out into kind of like a couple key sections. So I think that every decision, whether it's for a product or something else, there's really first the identification of that issue, where we realize that this is something that multiple people will need to will be impacted by within the team, that impacts customers, and we need to like do something more than just me make the decision in the moment. Like it's a very small decision, right? Like there needs to be some discourse, which I think is very separate from the actual decision-making point, right? This is where you collect options, you refine options, you talk about the value of options, the capability of the team, things like that. The decision ideally is a much smaller group of people, right? And that is where, if you do something like consensus based decision-making, you end up kind of jamming discourse and decision together a lot of the time when they should be much more separate. There's communication of that decision, right? Which ends up being much more of a blast of like, hey, just in case we forgot anybody, here's what we're doing. And then finally, learning, which I think is very, very important. And so what we could think of is really any document as going through some type of process like this, especially if we assume that a document is something that is being highly contextual and collaborative. Even things like strategy documents or charter documents still go through this process. It's just that the kind of communication and refinement where it's like set as a canonical document means that it is more likely to go through multiple cycles of this rather than just one cycle where maybe a brief document would only go through one cycle of this. And so there's a bunch of different things that I think are valuable or important here. And when I talk about like kind of the way that these loops happen, it's not always just a straight line, right? There's this idea that if we get to a decision and there's a rejection of the options, that goes back to the discourse stage. Or if we communicate out, we forgot someone, we have to go back to the discourse phase again to make another decision. And then this like learning to identification is really all about like what's referred to usually as double loop learning, but it's not so much like, were we right with this decision, but how did our decision-making process actually work? Did it give us the options that we thought we should? And so every document ends up going through this type of process. And so I think it's important once we identify that, what does that mean for kind of the way we end up doing things? And I think this is very much related to organizational cultures. And so when I talk about organizational cultures, there's a bunch of kind of extremes, I guess, that certain organizations may adhere to. And there's a bunch of different papers that are out there. I've seen, like 4 different organizational cultures, things like that. I wanted to identify a couple key kind of organizational spectrums that I think have different impacts on the way that this whole process ends up working. And so, for example, we're talking about like teams that end up using very small or very large iterations. And so when I would say small iterations, that's usually kind of any type of team that would be like an agile team probably has very small loop iteration, whereas teams that still use waterfall or gated development end up having much larger iteration. And so that means that the kind of update cadence or how fast we end up moving through that particular decision-making framework ends up either being very fast or very slow. And I think more than anything, we should not just assume that fast or slow means more or less documentation, right? Generally, I would still advocate that you try to write as little as possible in these documents. But I think it is important to understand that these cadences end up meaning that the type of meetings that you would need to have end up becoming larger, right? So for example, in a large iteration type of thing, the discourse component of that whole decision-making ends up being a lot larger because you need to talk with more people, you need to consider more things. And so I think that's a very kind of like interesting cultural thing that we need to consider. When we talk about like the different types of review styles, right? Some teams really love synchronous, right? Like everything has to happen inside of a meeting. Everything has to happen with a discussion. Others prefer asynchronous. Groups like Amazon kind of have an in-between where there's a lot of asynchronous work that happens before. Inside of the synchronous meetings, they actually stop for, somewhere in the range of 20, 30 minutes to be able to read through the document in the meeting and basically do the review and then have a discussion. But I think these review styles mean that the discourse component of this ends up being changed in some ways. And so I do think that like having a combination of asynchronous and synchronous is really valuable, where we use kind of like asynchronous as a way to gather options and refine them and understand the breadth of the problem. And then synchronous to really kind of like answer any other burning questions, understand where everybody stands. And then I think that there's a separation of that type of thing where a decision-making organization, whatever that team is that makes the decision, and there's a bunch of different ways. I have another talk called Deciding How to Decide, if people are interested, but I talk a lot about these like differences between like consent versus consensus. What does it mean to have like an autocratic decision maker, which is not always a bad thing. At Amazon, they would call that a single-threaded leader, I believe, where the person has to make a decision. So this will change the way your documents end up working as well. The next thing is review types. And so I've definitely been on teams where people are highly engaged, right? Like they want to be part of the discourse. They want to be part of this kind of collaboration, and they're very engaged. And so the way that you end up going through this cycle, even things like the identification and discourse of the decision-making for that document ends up being like highly engaged. But there are other times where people are very disengaged. And this could be where, teams have very strong kind of roles and responsibilities. And so they don't think about anything other than what's inside their kind of role profile. But I think this ends up creating problems sometimes inside of reviews because you may want to get in front of more people, but they're just not going to read the document that you have. And so this may then want you to tilt towards more synchronous discussions because people seem more disinterested unless you're actually in front of them. The review audience could change based on how siloed your organizations are. So again, like that roles and responsibilities I talked about, if there's a real clear delineation of who owns what when it comes to decision making, you end up having much more of like a gated. First, the PRFAQ is done and then completed, then the PRD, then the technical design document, and you end up having like very, very kind of specific punctuated differences between those things. Whereas I've found that generally in like more collaborative environments, you end up having a lot of overlap between these different documents. And there's actually a benefit. I mean, I prefer more collaborative documents personally because, or more collaborative types of organizations, because it means that you end up trading a lot more information. And I think you have to go back and forth between steps a lot less because it's all kind of blending a little bit. Now, the problem there is that it's hard to delineate when you're able to do that. And this is one of the ways you can deal with that is have a stronger culture around kind of like sign-offs in some ways, or having a decision being communicated. But I think that's like a very important or interesting kind of spectrum to think about. And then when it comes to approval cycles, right, you can either work at places that have highly autonomous teams where they kind of decide when they're ready to get going and change the stage that they're in, versus very bureaucratic ones. And usually the bureaucratic ones just end up being very large teams, right? Like those large teams have had problems in the past where something went forward when they found out that it was not as valuable. And so they end up then creating a lot of checkpoints or stopping points, essentially to keep people from making the same mistake in the future. Of course, then when there's a crisis, all of this bureaucratic stuff goes out the window, and we start to then kind of realize and hyper-focus again on how do we make decisions at an autonomous or smaller level. And so I think understanding where you are, I think you're not able to necessarily break out of bureaucratic institutions, but you can at least do your best job to get ahead of the bureaucratic stuff, because you still want the team to operate as autonomously as possible. But if you can get ahead of kind of the approvals, it means that your documents may take on a slightly different format, and you may want to put more high value information up front in the process so that you can get that approved and then deal with things later. But that's where also bureaucracy may require you to like really hyper define the way things are working. So then you may want to like actually move all of these different documents into the same phase so that you can actually get across all the different requirements. So I think that's like something that I've found to be very important or interesting to think about. And usually more highly bureaucratic types of groups end up using more steady cadence when it comes to the way that they end up doing things. And I wrote a post for the Uncertainty Project that was about like Kairos versus Chronos time, which is Chronos time is like standard cadences for decision making in some way, whereas Kairos time is much more narrative and based on events. And so I think there's like some interesting differences between those two different types of at least decision making rhythms. I think that every team will alternate between those, but understanding where you are within this bureaucratic to autonomous kind of spectrum is really important, because that will define or help you do a better job of actually these document cycles within your team. So what are some other cultures that you found? Like, what are other cultural spectrums that may have come up for people if, and feel free to add in the chat, like what have you seen when it's come to this? I only put down a couple that I thought were really valuable, but I'd love to hear if there's any, any that you think I missed as far as cultural spectrums. Nothing? I've kind of covered all the cultural spectrums. Overwriting plus over design. Yeah, I think like how comprehensive people are in these documents. I think this is probably also related to more bureaucratic, large iteration types of groups, is that they end up like writing way too much. Totally agree. And actually, to your second point, Alex, like the overcommitting to a comprehensive design is a real issue, right? Like trying to decide too much up front, I think can be an anti-pattern in my opinion. But also like for those more highly bureaucratic types of organizations, they want to actually decide everything up front because they want to believe that reliability of decision making is valuable. Whereas like, in highly uncertain and kind of like urgent environments, more like improvisational types of decision making is much better, or at least fares better usually, because you can adjust over time. And so Pecky actually asked, like, does planning cadence come into this? Yeah, I think that's what I meant by like kind of the small or large iteration, is that if you end up having like weekly sprints, I think you're able to fine tune things much faster. The people will see kind of like less progress overall between every update, versus like if we're talking about like say quarterly roadmap review process type of things, you're going to see much bigger changes. But this also depends on the type of projects and the size of the teams, right? So I think there is something there about that. Yeah, and thank you for adding over engineering without ROI. Yeah, so this is maybe related to the idea of like technical debt and servicing of technical debt. My personal opinion is that we should not be putting aside a budget for a certain amount of technical debt work. We should always be rolling technical debt or perception of technical debt into updates that we end up making for customers. And there should be a customer impact, right? If something is really hard to add additional options, or there's like a really bad system that is causing lots of outages, that is a customer impacting thing. And we should weigh it just like every other thing, rather than this idea of like we give a blank check every quarter of 20% of our time to just like do random stuff without an impact to customers. So I totally agree with that. Cool. So doc management, I think this is something I'm still trying to, I guess, figure out more. But I wanted to at least pose some questions that I think are really important when we talk about longer term document management. So like we've done these cycles, not only just the software development cycle, right, which is for the kind of like whole lifetime of the feature, but like inside of these things, like what is that document? How long does it live? And how is it kind of like a decision point, which is usually a sign off? What are the things that we need to think about when it comes to like overall document management? Because if you have a team, say of just like, say 10 people, and they're shipping a feature every quarter, that's like 40 documents. Those are just 40 PRDs just there, right? If you'd say that there's like 4 or 5 document total, that's 160 documents that you now have to organize just for that team, right? And usually teams are much larger than that end up sitting in the same repository. They end up being, they may even have like, we're not even talking about like just briefs around problems that we're finding or just other decisions that are inside of these different things. And so you could talk about like for a team of 10 product managers, right, you could have hundreds of documents every year generated. And as much as we try to do kind of either taxonomy or like intranet pages for pointers, these things get kind of unwieldy at a certain point. And we try to then depend on search for things, and still document search, I would say, is just okay, like in a lot of ways. So I guess like, what are the 2 things you should be optimizing for, in my opinion? And it's posed as 2 questions here. So when should we know about new documents, right? When should a document now be kind of available to the team to be reviewed, to be audited, to be kind of understood by management, a bunch of things like that. And so this is generally part of the software development cycle we talked about, like when do we get into the conceptual stage? When do we need approval of that type of thing? But I think that is a really, really important aspect. And then the second thing is like, when should we start to archive documents? So we want the working set of documents really to be as small as possible. And we want that to be organized in such a way that these are the active documents. When we talk about archive documents, what we're saying is like, this document is no longer up to date, where, you know, even if we ship this feature and the feature still exists, that feature is now drifted as we've started to fix bugs, we've started to make changes, even in smaller ones, if they're not necessarily fully documented, where that document is no longer kind of like the canonical way to talk about it. So I think like that is something that is really, really important, is this kind of concept of when are there documents that should be notifying everybody, when are documents should be like moved away and kind of deprecated in some way. And so, yeah, Ralph asked, like, how do we asynchronously educate other cross-functional teams to use documents for education reference? And so, yeah, I think this problem is, I think, in some ways related to what is the working set. And I think one of the things I've found, at least to be more valuable for people, is that a lot of the time, teams that have dependencies on your team and vice versa, the main ways that they end up actually understanding those dependencies are, I would say 3 main ways. So one is through dependency goal setting, like OKRs. And so referencing those canonical documents or updating them or adding them to those documents is important. A lot of the time roadmaps, and that could be a specific roadmap for a partner that's internal. It could be a customer facing roadmap. There's a bunch of different roadmaps that you may end up having, but if it's a dependency team, they're usually internal. And so you can then inside that roadmap actually have links to ideally the customer focused documents like PRFAQs, but it could also be PRDs. And so they can see then as things change, they can start to understand what's going on with that. And then finally, I think like status reports, right? Like the idea that you're communicating changes in like the way things are working to people, I think is really important. And so those are kind of the main ways that I see you constantly educating people about what is going on, is through those types of documents. And so, and I think that's where, whenever something gets deprecated, say an item is pulled off of a roadmap, it's not as simple as just doing it and then it disappears and no one has to worry about it anymore. Like I think there should be almost like like a row or maybe even a column for roadmaps that just says like these things have been deprecated or no longer being worked on, because there are plenty of times where a feature is just considered not be valuable, and so we like take resources off of it. And so we should be communicating any of this kind of like addition, change, or removal of items from these like roadmaps or OKRs. And so I think those are kind of like some examples of the ways that I would do that. Now, it's going to be different for every culture, of course. There may be different expectations. Like inside of Google, OKRs are used an awful lot to create dependencies between teams. But then in other places I've seen, it ends up being an awful lot like who's like a reviewer on your document or your feature ends up kind of being the equivalent of a dependency in some way. So that's what I would say. So, just to kind of like finish out, I don't have a lot of great ideas yet about this, and this is something that's still very experimental, but I think this is something that you should consider for your cultures, is like, what is the cadence for how people discover new documents? And then what is the cadence by which you actually specifically archive documents? I think one good thing is that like inside of Google Docs, there is a way to like look at your activity on a document. So if you see a document that's just like never referenced ever again, that's maybe a sign that this thing should be archived, because it's just clearly not valuable anymore. It's not being referenced, it's not being updated. And same thing with like new documents. You can do searches of like new documents inside your document store based on modification date. And so like doing like a regular check on that. Now, I think there should be more automated tools for this type of thing, but I think there's like the beginning of how we do better document management, I think is something that is part of like intranet sites that we should be thinking about more. And so now, like going beyond the basics, I want to kind of point to a couple things. One, I want to point to kind of the first thing, and maybe if there's one thing that you take away from this talk, is that readability is the most important aspect of any document you write. And when I say readability, it's for the audience that you're actually providing this document to. So if the document is for your cross-functional team to be able to make a decision about a feature, their ability to read that and parse that document is most important. If it's a brief that is for like a very senior team to be able to help make a decision, their understanding of that document and readability of that document. And I use readability in particular because it's this idea of, am I able to actually parse this information based on the design of the document, how much text is written, how the text is written, what information is in there. Those are all things that go into this like readability that I think is really, really important. And so like, that's the one thing I want you to take away from here. Every document, it's all about readability. So there's a couple things that I think make this better. Amazon has a really great writing culture. And I think like, if you want a better writing culture, you need to have better reading culture by executives. That's one of the things I always like to say, because yeah, you can write everything you want, but if people are not reading it, then it doesn't matter. But there's been like a couple things. So I can link to this in the slides, and afterwards I can provide these resources, but there's 3 really great articles that kind of talk about the way to do this. And so a lot of Amazon's tips, and this is from a set of Medium articles that I'll link to, but like that are not mine. But I think they summarize this reading culture really, or this writing culture really well. So making everything really short, replacing adjectives with data, eliminating what they call weasel words. When someone says, so what, are they able to actually pull out some information? This last piece about getting, if you're trying to answer a question about something, this is really the terminology of answer then explain, right? You want to answer and then give explanation. I think sometimes people overload the explanation at the top and then answer at the bottom, and that's not a good way to write a document. Second thing is this idea of going from like very subjective things to very objective things. And so there's examples here of that. And then, jargon, this I think comes back to readability. Who's your audience? Who's actually going to read this? Will they understand the jargon you're using, including technical terms, right? And then again, weasel words, another thing that like Amazonians seem to just like bristle against. And I would say that like one of their things that at least I've heard from people is that their writing culture is really great. And I've tried to adopt a lot of these rules, and I think they're very valuable. So when we talk about like the way I think about things, this is very specifically my type of writing culture that I think is valuable. So my philosophy for writing in general, right, is that less is more, right? So when we talk about the idea of writing a document that's readable, right, the less you write, the better. Now, it can get to an extreme where you don't write anything of meaning, right? But less is more. You should always just get to the point. Like, do not talk a lot about, like, don't add a lot of extra terminology, a lot of extra words. You should just get to the point as fast as possible. Following this kind of this particular model is something that came from like learning and education. But I think it's a really powerful way to like write any summary for a document is a what, so what now. So what is the situation right now? What's going on? So what is like, why does it matter to us? And then now what is like, what are we going to do about it? If you follow that narrative in your summary, you will write a very impactful kind of introduction to help frame the document. A lot of the time, multiple audiences need their own document. So trying to create one document for everybody is actually, I think, a bad thing. And I'll tell you why in a moment. And then again, even less than you think is more. So a lot of the times when I see people writing, like, say, strategy documents, they'll write like a 20-page document about their strategy, when the reality is like they probably could write a 10-page document. And then they should also be able to then write a 5-page, a 1-page, and a half-page version of that. And so that's an exercise I always tell everybody, not only with strategy, but like almost with any document, you need to have those kind of levels of understanding and then find which one is appropriate for the audience, just to go back to the last point. The next thing I would say is that there's use of like templates. And so because I end up working in like product ops type of roles a lot of the time, I help with templates. And so the templates, I think there's a particular philosophy that I end up taking with templates that I think is powerful and valuable. So the first thing is that it should always be the minimum sections required, okay? Not the maximally comprehensive ones. So yes, you could have every possible section in a template, but again, templates need to be usable, right? And so for me, it's always fine if people want to add additional sections because they need it, because that helps facilitate a better discussion. But I would argue that in your template, it should be the minimum required that you think is valuable and powerful for across your entire team, right? So I think that's really, really important. The next thing is that like being aesthetically simplistic is powerful in the way that people end up parsing things. And so there are sometimes I've seen templates where the entire first page is just like tons and tons and tons of metadata. And the reality is most people don't read it, right? Maybe what they want to understand is what's the draft, like, is this a draft or in prod, like how many times is this reviewed? Maybe who's the main point of contact, right? Things like that I think are really important. But this idea of like overdoing the way that the document looks, and this could also include like the idea of having, 1.5.6.3.5.a like types of titles and headings and everything. Again, readability is really important, and adding all this additional stuff to it actually doesn't help the readability. It can help with references, right? Like if you want to use bookmarks, I think those are a really great thing to use inside of a document to be able to like point to a particular thing. You should be using links to be able to link to other places in the document if you need to. So there's a lot of other ways to do this that are still kind of like more aesthetically simplistic, that then help improve readability and just usability of the document in general. And when we talk about readability, I think that there's this kind of goal to make documents have a lot of information, but that they're very small in some way. And so what that has usually meant is that people will use like really small fonts to minimize page count. They'll remove a lot of extra spacing between paragraphs. And I think that's a really bad idea. And the reason why is that you want this to be just like readable. It's no longer that you're in a, you're not in school trying to like maximize word count or minimize the number of pages to be able to fit into a certain assignment. I think it's much more about like what is just readable. And if for example, you do have rules like Amazon has the 6-pager rule, sometimes people will require like a summary in 1 page. You need to just write it in a summary in 1 page that is not fiddling with the font size. And so what does 1 page even mean anymore with like the idea of an endless document where we don't print them out? So I would just say, like, again, see previous. For these templates, though, you should not be creating things that are super dense, because again, it makes it hard to read, makes people feel like this is going to be a really hard document to read rather than one that they're going to enjoy reading in some way. And so, I talked about kind of how do you understand whether people understand your writing. And so basically, just like we would do user testing for something, we should be testing our writing with people. And the way that I kind of do this, I think, is very simple. So write as little as possible. Basically, the least that you think should go into this document, I want you to write that. And there's been some interesting things like 1 page, 1 hour, things like that, type of concepts. But you write as little as possible. It should be formatted well. It should be polished, right? It should be readable, but it should be as little as possible. You should work with someone that you trust, and that has like, wants to help you in some way. Let them read it. Do not give them any commentary. Don't give them like a 5-minute speech about what's in this document. Just say, this document is something I'm going to send out people for X. Here's the audience, and here's the type of feedback I want. Then after they've read the document, you should ask them, what is the most important thing that they learned? Like, did you actually nail the most important thing? What wasn't clear? right? Like, was there anything here that kind of like got muddied as far as a concept, was hard to understand? And then finally, what do you want to know more about? So what are things that maybe I missed that should be in here? And as you can tell, these are kind of things that usually I would ask about a talk or about like even a function when I'm doing user research. And so I think that's incredibly valuable to learn. So you can do this with people individually. You just like ask them for a 30-minute meeting, say that you need some help with the document. If they're okay with that, then basically just follow this process. And I think you'll learn so much about your documents that you will write better documents. Now, this doesn't get into all the other stuff the Amazon tips were about, or even just in general, there's like great books like On Writing Well. There's a couple other like talks that are really great that I can send a list of kind of resources to everybody afterwards. This doesn't talk about kind of like all the other aspects of just like great copywriting, but I think at the very least, you'll start to dial in what is valuable from a document standpoint. And so I guess like, you know, when I think about document culture inside of different organizations, to me, I actually want to know what has worked here, right? Now, more often than not, people don't have good references of documents that have worked well. A lot of the time because most documents don't work well. And so I think like what you should be asking about is you should be asking about like what has worked here as a process, and then trying to capture that in a way that is valuable inside of a document. You should be understanding that and building on top of it, right? It doesn't mean that you can never change anything, but like the second thing you should be doing is like, what could we try here, right? Could we try a 1 page, 1 hour type of thing if everybody has that as an expectation and we're not getting like a perception hit because of that? Can we try, you know, only doing this type of document and separating these documents out? There's a bunch of things that you should just try. So from a case study, just really quickly, you know, I was working at Microsoft very early in the 2000s for Hotmail, which was an email client. And what we were trying to do is pull together a meeting request PRD. And this meeting request PRD was fairly complex. It had to integrate between Hotmail, Outlook, Exchange, Lotus Notes, and then 3 different like internet standards for meeting requests. So it was a very complicated document. It ended up being across the document at first 550 pages long. Okay, outrageously long as a document. What I ended up doing, though, was breaking it into 8 different documents for different audiences and doing 8 different reviews. And those reviews took an entire day where I scheduled them like one after another for me. So it was exhausting for me. But for every piece of that audience, they ended up having a much more dialed in understanding of what was going on. And so I guess what I learned at that kind of like early stage of my career was that not everything should be in a doc, right? Like I tried to be comprehensive, and a majority of the documentation was never commented on and probably never used by the engineers. Like mapping our database fields or like metadata to RFCs, they were going to do that anyways, and there probably wasn't something that like I really needed to do. Do not try to force every audience into every document. So like the first meeting I had was with our management team for approval of this particular feature, but that document was like 3 pages long. And so that particular type of review is very different than the in the depth, like how are we going to adopt this data model from these RFCs to our data model. And then, you know, for sure, the first draft of your document is never final, right? There should always be changes. You should always make sure that there's changes, in fact, because if you as an individual are coming up with everything that needs to be written down up front, then I feel like you're probably not actually like learning an awful lot from the way things are going. And so I would argue that you should always assume that change is going to happen ever. And so in summary, you know, and I'd love to take some questions now. First, write the right amount, right? You should be focused on just the right amount, not too much. You should consider your cultural norms around the way that documents and kind of decision-making in general work, and then test your writing, right, for readability specifically, because that is the most important thing about every single one of these documents. So with that, thank you. I will pause now for Q&A, but if people want to get in touch or connect on LinkedIn, I'm always happy to. I'd love to hear how people end up using this as well. So if this helped you change any habits, I would love to, you know, I'd love to hear that. And so, yeah, if people want to now start adding questions into the chat, please do. Can I please show any example of PRD? I cannot show you any of the current examples of PRDs because they're inside of the confidentiality of the organization. But there are templates that are out there. They're not too bad. But I would just say that, like, you know, this is a real issue, I think, actually, with product management in general, is that product managers have a very hard time assembling a portfolio of work because it's usually inside of like confidentiality. So unfortunately, I can't show you anything today. Maybe, you know, for a future version of this talk, though, let me put together like what a a not like a standard one would, but honestly, use the headings in your document formats, maybe add some color, maybe add a logo from your organization. But honestly, that's how you get started with these templates, is not through any particular way of like having a perfect template that you copied from someone else. Honestly, even John Cutler, I think, has talked a lot about that type of thing, is that you should be creating templates that are appropriate for your organization. He has some great posts about that. So can you give us your favorite mental model when writing specs? Randomness is what you used for me last time. Yeah, I think like, oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I'd just like to quickly take a minute before taking up opening the session for Q&A. I'll just quickly launch, the poll here in the audience, folks. You can go ahead and, drop your, how did you like the workshop, drop the ratings for the workshop as well. So that will help us build better content, for you guys, and also will help us understand better what kind of topics you guys are looking forward to learn more about, and, understand how your experiences have been into this workshop. So please go ahead and participate in the poll that I've launched, and that will take quick 5 to 10 seconds. Okay. And by the time you guys can, go ahead and drop in your questions in the chat. Yes. Also, I've shared Chris, LinkedIn profile as well in the chat box for the folks who are looking forward to go ahead and connect with him personally over LinkedIn. So it's there in the chat. You can go ahead and check that. I'll just wait for 2 to 3 more seconds. You guys can go ahead and take the poll. Chris, you can take the questions by the time. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Great. So Ralph's question was like, what are some mental models when writing specs? I think so. The idea of like random constraints is really interesting. Like from the standpoint, and what he's mentioning here is that, I think this concept of what are we trying to get done and how we get it done. I think you can start to do a better job of thinking of what's really important. If you say like, what if I only had a weekend or $1,000 or one engineer for a week to implement this thing? What would be the first step that would help us learn, help us execute better, any of that type of thing? And so I think like when you're reviewing your document, this idea of like kind of different random constraints, I think is really powerful. I would also just ask about like, within the document, you should not be repeating yourself a lot. Like one of the things I've seen in some documents more recently was some people will have like a summary, they'll have an overview, and they'll have a background section, and they're all the same thing. They're just like written slightly differently. But I think like you should have as little information, like actually Nassim Taleb talks about this a lot, which I think is interesting, is even though he's kind of like an ornery person on Twitter, one of the things he would say about documents or about books is that if they could be compressed down to one like summary, that all of that extra part of the book is just not valuable in some way. And so I think that's a question you should be asking yourself as a heuristic, is like, how much am I repeating myself in each of these sections, basically? And how can I like basically make one section that is the summary, for example, to be as powerful as possible, so I don't have to like keep on repeating myself, and I can link to other things like that. So I think that's another kind of heuristic I think is important or interesting. Alex asks, like, can you talk more about how do you carve out audiences for a document? Is it by type of approval? Kind of type of requirements. I think these are all appropriate, like things to break up. I think when we talk about type of approval, I do think that if we're saying that we need like there's a trade-off that we're trying to make that is particularly like tricky or complex or something like that, I think you should write a brief about it, and you can link off to your PRD in those cases. But I think like being very specific to the key trade-off, because when it comes to executives, they have very little time, very little context, and usually very little patience. So like I would say if you have to write something like that, you should be splitting that off into a separate document. Different levels of abstraction within the organization are a good way to end up doing that as well. And then, yeah, of course, review audiences who actually is supposed to mostly approve, but at least provide feedback inside of this document or collaborate inside this document is another thing. So like in a technical design document, that should be written for more technical people, but there should probably be linkage back to like, how do these different technical decisions end up impacting customer kind of the way that customers end up doing their work. And so that's the part that I would say is like, I think you need to do. So I think this is where it's basically the different audiences and maybe either overlap or non-overlap between them. And if there's overlap, it's okay to have 2 different documents. Like one of the experiments I wanted to start trying was having actually different PRFAQs where we're making an argument about how this is valuable, because there's like, if it's for different teams, for example, we may want to use different PRFAQs to show that value. And so we'll rewrite the PR part kind of for different people. So I think it's like an experiment, but I think like level of abstraction, how much information do they need to make that decision? And if the decision is like, this whole feature, what are we doing? That's the whole PRD. But if it's like, here's one trade-off, I think you end up like making it much smaller. So Mendar says, or asks, does mind mapping work when it's a complete new product or feature? Yeah, I think mind mapping is a great exploration activity. And this is probably what I was talking about, that you should be collaborating with your team up front as part of a kickoff before you actually start really writing the PRD. And so one of those things could be, let's talk about all of the problems we think our customers have. Or a great exercise is something called assumption mapping by David J. Bland, where you get a cross-functional team together and actually talking through all of the different assumptions we have, and then placing it on a 2x2 of how much evidence do we have and how important it is. And so from there, we can then start to identify what is most important that we have the least evidence about. And that can then lead to maybe your question about experiments to a certain extent, but also the idea of we're starting to explore all of the different pieces of information that we have for this. Doing a pre-mortem is interesting because you start talking about all the possible failure or stress cases for this project. Even doing things very divergent types of activities like crazy eights or 6-ups to be able to explore the solution space, right? And then convergent activities to talk about what do we think is the best way to do things. I think mind mapping is another one of those for exploration. So I think these are good activities to start and kick off the process with, but I don't think necessarily they're you may want to show some work around your mind mapping, but honestly, it's so messy usually. I mean, Wardley mapping is another example where there's no wrong map and every map should just be thrown away after it's done. But I think those exercises are really valuable. Great. Jenna Deep asks, what part of the PRD can we leverage AI tools? Okay. So one of the things I think has been interesting has been for the PR part of the PR FAQ, I like getting inspiration for how asking some type of generative algorithm to create a press release in the style of X, launching a feature that is about Y, and I want you to create 2 quotes by 2 engineers, blah, blah, blah. I think it ends up creating a fairly interesting kind of high level architecture for you to do it. If you have a problem where it's the blank page. I would say though that if you are able to generate all of the journeys, with something like a generative algorithm, it's probably not a very valuable feature, right? If this thing is able to generate that stuff, I wonder how valuable it is. So now it doesn't mean that you can't come up with what are some of the failure cases. I think this is a great way to explore failure cases or to come up with interesting inspirations for ideas. But I think if you're just having it write all of your journeys, I don't know, it would make me wonder why we're actually building this feature if it's just going to be the standard way of building that feature. And I think it gets divorced a little bit from the idea of how are we actually focusing on customer need in some way. So those are some ideas I have about this, but I think there's a lot more to do when it comes to the way we use generative algorithms, especially when it comes to the blank page, right? Templates to a certain extent are kind of a framework for us to then think within, right? And so I think there's something there that maybe having a generative algorithm ask you questions that might be valuable to help you think more, I think would be great as well. So Ralph asks, how much feedback should you be sampling from stakeholders on PRD? Should be do it during the writing process once it's finalized? I think it depends in general about where they are. Are they part of the group that's going to have to work on the thing? If that's the case, then they should definitely have feedback in the writing process. If they're an executive that just has a very strong opinion about things, I think it's closer to the decision-making part of it. But here's the thing about feedback too, is that not all feedback is equal, right? Just because someone has commented on your document, it doesn't mean that you need to address that comment, right? This is a great case would be someone says, well, what about this case? And you're well, we're not going to worry about that case. So you should, ideally get back to that person, right? To close the loop. You should document it in the document that we're not going to do this specifically, and you close it. And that's okay. I mean, I think it depends on how much of a decision-making authority they should have over that type of thing. And so I think feedback in general, I guess I come from the point of view that you should always listen to feedback, right? But it's up to you. And there's a book called Thank You for the Feedback, which I think is a great book about not only giving feedback, but how to take feedback in some way. It's up to you to decide how that feedback is contextualized in some way. And so in some cases, that may mean that you just say, thank you for the feedback, but we're not going to do anything with this feedback. So I think that's perfectly acceptable. Stephen, he asks, any advice on how to engage and encourage team members to contribute to the document asynchronously? I think one of the things is that sometimes people don't know how to contribute. So marking different sections with one of the things I've done is I've tried to use like yellow highlight to say that this is like an open issue or a question that I don't know the answer to. And so in sections where I haven't really known what to write down yet, what I will do is I will add a bunch of different questions I have about that topic area. And it could be about a journey, it could be about goals. And I'll actually tag the people that I think would be helpful in helping decide this specifically. So I think being very specific about what you're asking for from people, I think is really, really valuable. But I think that's a really good starting point. And then, of course, you should have like a cross-functional team where team members are identified. If you don't, that's a different type of problem, where you're probably like, there are some cases I've seen where even just like the charter or the PRFAQ doesn't have an engineering lead yet, for example. It's hard to be in those cases because you want their feedback. You want some type of like grounding in the way that engineering thinks about things. But I think being very specific about inviting them to the document and asking them for help with questions, I think is a great way to do that. I think for the experiment I've done, so one experiment that was kind of interesting is for a naming process we have internally, we've been starting to use veto-based decision-making, where we have a template for kind of like, here's the name that is proposed, here's the other names we considered, here's why we're picking this name, and here's the other information we have about the name. It becomes one document sent asynchronously. We have a 30-minute meeting that happens like a week or two after that, where people can ask questions. And then basically after that meeting, people have about 2 business days to basically veto the name, or it just moves forward in the process. And so that's an experiment. It seemed to work pretty well. Like I haven't had a lot of problems where people have been upset that we've moved forward. And if anything, like the people that usually get bogged down in these naming discussions feel like they drag along. So like legal and other people like that, they've enjoyed the fact that we are able to like move forward in some way. So that's an experiment I've tried out. And I've realized that we're just at time right now. Sorry, I can't answer all the questions, but thank you so much for all the great questions. And, would love to connect on LinkedIn, and, great to see everybody that I have seen at other places. And thank you again for all the time today. I really appreciated the conversation. I would love to hear what you learned from this and what you try. So thank you.
All right. Thanks again. Thanks, Chris, again for joining us live today, and thanks, folks, for joining us live today and taking forward this session as well. I'll quickly reshare Chris' LinkedIn profile as well. Go ahead and connect with him. And if you like the session as well, just do make a LinkedIn post as well. Do tag Chris as well, and also Growth School team, so we get to know that you attended the session and you liked it as well. Share your learnings as well from the session. What did you guys learn about PRDs, and what did you guys learn from the session actually? So looking forward to your post. Yeah, exactly. All right. I already see many people in the chat section telling about how good the session was. So that's really great. Again, thanks everyone for joining us live. Thanks, Chris, for taking the session. Looking forward to have more product management sessions with you. Yeah. Cool.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, folks. Thanks. Bye-bye. Yeah.